Tonight we wish to consider the regulatory and disciplinary functions of the law of Moses. Before you groan and you say, oh dear, let's just realise that the benefit of this particular consideration is that we might realise how God administered justice when the theocracy of Israel existed, and most importantly for us to see that God's values and morals have not changed with the times. And God has not tried to conform himself to the modern age in which we live. Many of the principles and values in Israel's code of law are very likely to be re-established in God's kingdom when God rules amongst the mortal populations of the world. So many of these laws we're going to consider tonight, without any doubt, are going to be very much part of the future for this world. Much of the ritual of Israel may not be reinstituted, but certainly the laws and the morals and the values will be. Living in the 21st century as we do, we live in a world that has moved completely away from the way that God sees things and the way that God administers justice. And we have to remember and remind ourselves tonight that God has not changed with the times. Now, just reminding ourselves of this statement from the 1st of Timothy that we looked at last Saturday night, we need to understand that when God gave the bulk of the law of Moses, it was for a new nation. It was for the regulation of a people that had been rescued from slavery, who somewhat probably lacked initiative. They'd had no formal code of worship. They'd had no set of rules to work by. And now they would be made into a nation to be a kingdom of priests for God. So there was the need for regulation. There was a need for God to lay down the civil code, the case law, the ritual and worship that they would go through, and a lot of things had to be laid down. And Paul makes the point that this was primarily for the regulation of the unspiritual. It was not made for those who had the faith to see through the principles of the law. It was made to regulate those who needed regulation. And the national law had to cut off all the excesses of human nature that it is capable of. And so we have a legal code. We have punishments for different violations that are laid down. So why are we looking at this? Well, we are not a national ecclesia. We are not a theocracy in the truest sense yet. We do not have power to administer punishment or to stone offenders. But, brethren and sisters, we are working on understanding what it takes to administer the kingdom of God. And by looking at the way that God administered his theocracy in the past, we have a very good idea of the sort of things that will be required to administer when the kingdom comes. Because God's view of sin and the way he treats it has not altered. And when these things do arise in our midst, we need to deal with them in a way that would be in harmony with God's morality. Now, the modern world has made a big mistake in thinking that God has gone soft. If you ask the bulk of people, even Bible-believing people, does the God of the Old Testament seem relevant to you today? And they would say most definitely not. Stoning would be completely out of the question. They would even think that God has changed his morals, because all they hear about is love and kindness and mercy. And while those things are incredibly important, it's not the whole picture of God. Very few people today would know that the New Testament God also makes some incredibly strong statements about morality. In the 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, know you not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators or idolaters or adulterers, nor effeminate, nor sodomites, says Young's Literal, nor thieves or covetous or drunkards, revilers or extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. And you see, God is absolutely firm on his values and his morals. And there are many similar statements you can line up that say the same things. And you see, the main principles of the law were very much against the things that men are inclined to do. We find in the law that God's consistent morality said there should be a separation from idolatrous religions of the world, and incredibly against those that were practicing immorality themselves. So not only idolatry is banned, but particularly those religions like the Canaanite religion, which was immoral. No toleration of alternate lifestyles or sexual deviations. Marriage was to be only in the faith of the hope of Israel. Complete honesty in all our dealings, no lying, stealing or false witness. If you look there at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13, thou shalt not defraud thy neighbour, neither rob him. So there was, right through the law, this idea of honesty, because God is honest. And you find with Leviticus 19 that all of these statements and laws that God's laid down have on the end of them, because I am Yahweh. You do this or you don't do this because I am Yahweh. And that's true God manifestation. So all of those things were part of the principles that underlie God's laws. Now I want to repeat something I said last Saturday night, because we need to also understand that in the law God deals with things that he regulated but did not want to happen. You see, there are many things that men will do. God knows that people are fallible. God knows that people will go down paths he would not have them to do. And so in those cases, God regulates how those things will be handled should they happen. It doesn't mean that God wanted them to happen. For example, as we said, some things like divorce, some things like the way captives in battle would be treated. God didn't say, go out and do it. There was no positive command to do those things. He said, if I know you're going to do it, I know, said Jesus, because they were hard-hearted, they would do this. But God then said, there's still going to be regulations around it when you do it. And that was always designed to prevent further abuse to the victims. So it wasn't a sign of God's approval. It was always designed to present further abuse to the victims or the ones caught up in that situation. And we know things happen, that terrible things happen in war, as they often do. And God regulated those things because unspiritual men were inclined to do them. Okay, well, having got that background out of the way, I want to look now at how starkly different are the laws of God in the Old Testament in contrast to our modern legal system. And that's probably the best way for us to appreciate how wise God was. Now, this is just a summary of some things. We'll come over these and go over them again in detail. But look what God does. Murderers suffer the death penalty. No exceptions. No ransom was possible. If you were a murderer, it was the death penalty every time. That certainly prevented repeat offenders. In our legal systems in Australia, we no longer have the death penalty. We complain bitterly to other nations, as we see it, who have the gall to execute drug runners. We don't believe in the death penalty in Australia anymore. But with God, you murder, it was death penalty every time. People learnt to fear. False witnesses suffered the penalty they tried to inflict. We will come back to that one later on. There were no prisons. There was no such thing as bail. There was no smart lawyers allowed to go in and to bamboozle the courtroom with technicalities. And the punishments that were laid down were immediate. You were either fined, if it wasn't a death penalty, you were fined, or you were inflicted with stripes. So the punishment was immediate. Fines had to be paid off. If you couldn't pay off the fine, then you had to go into service and work off your debt. And this is the important difference. Reparations were always made to the victims. If you took somebody else's property, you destroyed somebody else's property, you were careless and your ox killed somebody else's ox, there were always reparations made. That doesn't happen in our legal system. Sometimes it was up to 4 times the value of the loss, and we'll see why in just a moment. But just as a matter of principle, how different is that to our legal code? You see, this is a wise and understanding people that were given this law. Now, outside of the way that God administered his justice, there was what we call case law. So you have commandments, you shall not do this, or if you do this, you will die. But then you have case law. Now, case law is where God gives you examples of how to deal with things. And I'll give you a few examples of that. So with case law, what you have are principles and precedents to be applied. The Lord didn't define every possible human situation. What it did, it gave you examples. In Leviticus 19, for example, you have there in verse 10, you shall not glean thy vineyard. And if you was, as I said, if you were a legalist, you could say, well, it doesn't mention olives. So the law had to be extended. This was a principle, that you leave the corners of your harvest. So you had to be generous. It didn't need God to define every possibility of being generous. And it was the same with the case law. You'd say, well, there's an example of how God wanted something dealt with. You would then extend that into different crimes of a similar nature. So it gave examples of penalties and how they would be applied. The Jews took much of this case law, and they actually made loopholes out of it to justify other things. Now, if you come to Exodus 22, let's just come to Exodus 22. Look at the matter of the man that steals an ox. Exodus 22 and verse 1. If a man steal an ox or a sheep and kill it, a bit like waltzing Matilda, isn't it? Or he sells it. So he's actually disposed of the animal. He's either eaten it or he's sold it. Look what it says. He shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So under the law, if you've taken somebody's ox, you've got to restore 5 oxen. Now, why would there be a 5-fold penalty? Well, one, it's a deterrent, isn't it? But you think of what that meant to the man whose ox has been stolen. He goes out to plough in the morning and there's no ox. By the time you're caught up with, by the time that judgment is made upon you, he's probably lost a week's work in his field. And what's more, he may have to buy a new ox. He may have to go to market and try and buy a suitable ox and train that ox. And it puts a lot of stress on him. So there's a lot of lost time and income, and that would be there for that man who's lost his ox. So God says there's got to be reparations. It's going to cost you 5 oxen if you steal somebody's ox. So not only deterrent, but also providing for the victim. Responsibility was encouraged. You know, there are laws about if somebody delivers you something to keep and you lose it or break it, then you've got to pay for it because you accepted that trust. So things on loan had to be accounted for. Safety was a societal responsibility. You know, people were required to think about damage that might happen to other people. You couldn't leave a pit open. If you'd been digging a hole and you had to finish for the night, you couldn't just walk inside and leave a great hole there for someone to fall into. But that was the only example of that sort of thing. But you see, that was case law. And so it just showed you that in cases where you left somebody in a dangerous position, you had to take responsibility for it. So, you know, the law was very specific. There was examples of case law that you could extend into cover all the other things that might happen in a nation like Israel. So they were just legal precedents or procedures that you could follow in similar cases. Let's just talk now about God's law and how just and how equal it was. I want you to come to Deuteronomy chapter 16. As we said, Deuteronomy is where Moses expands on the thou shalt not you get in Leviticus and Exodus, and Moses actually puts reasons around them. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 18, we have this matter of no respect of persons. Deuteronomy 16 verse 18, judges and officers thou shalt make in all thy gates. So right through the nation of Israel there were to be appointed people who were judges. The ones in Jerusalem were obviously more senior. And some of those priests and judges had direct access to God, and we'll see a case of that later on. But right through the nation, there were people appointed to make these decisions who had to take this case law and apply it. Look at the principles of these people. It says there, in verse 18, they shall judge thy people with just judgment. Thou shalt not wrest or twist judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, nor take a gift. For a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise. You see what Moses does? You go back to Leviticus, it says, you know, judgment has to be just. Moses says no. He says gifts blind the eyes of the wise. So he tells you why this is important, to get it right. And pervert the words of the righteous. And then he says in verse 20, thou shalt, that which is altogether just shalt thou follow. If you've got a margin, you will see that the Hebrew actually says, Justice, justice, absolute justice. And that's the emphasis of the Hebrew. Absolute justice thou shalt follow, that you may live and inherit the land which Yahweh thy God giveth unto thee. So you see, as humans, we often struggle, don't we? And human judges struggle with this, that to keep their decisions unbiased is very difficult. Sometimes people of importance get consideration that they should not have because they are well known in the community. Other times, poor people are given due consideration because of their status in society. But how much worse when different judgments are made because of past favours or because of obligations or family ties. And can I just say that in ecclesial life we have to be incredibly careful when matters come up which involve our family, because it's so easy to wrest judgment and to change what you knew or would have stood for once because your family is involved. And God says just judgment has to be applied. Now, there was a remarkable code of justice. Judges had to be utterly incorruptible. You think about that. You know, God says it about 6 or 7 times that judges must be absolutely uncorruptible. And you think of the damage that Samuel's sons did to the nation and the shame they brought upon their father because they took bribes. There was a very strict control of commerce. You were not allowed to use deceitful weights, have one weight for buying and one weight for selling. Priests and judges had to dispense justice absolutely without favour to the rich or the poor. Too often we find in our courtrooms that those who are rich can afford the expensive QC and get off on some technicality, or because the Crown case wasn't presented on the right form, or because they dug up some ancient precedent, and having the best lawyer sometimes gets people off crimes they should have paid for. And sometimes people are let off because, oh well, society has let them down and they didn't know any better. Well, under God's law, a crime was a crime. There were very few mitigating circumstances allowed when you look at the case law that God provided. So there were these superior principles, and just notice the contrast to our system with these things. Penalties will be fair and consistent. No difference because a thief is poor. Look at Exodus 23 and verse 3. You know, our courts look at a man and say, well, you know, he's poor, but it says, you shall not countenance a poor man in his cause. Now, God was very sympathetic to the poor on most occasions. God provided for the poor. But God says when it comes to judgment, a poor man gets no special treatment. If he knows what he should be doing, he's equally treated as a rich man. So God has a very clear picture of that. Immediate retribution, as we said, and restoration to be made. 4 times the restoration of the animals if the animal was found alive. It was only double if your animal was found alive. Still, there'd been a loss of time. If the ox had been stolen and had been on-sold and it was eventually recovered and got back to its owner, you still had to give him an extra ox to pay for his loss of time and his worry and insecurity that had now come upon him. And decisions had to be consistent and they had to be respected. Come back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. You know, God was very clear that people couldn't thumb their nose at the court and say, well, I don't agree with that decision. Once a decision was made, and especially one that was made by somebody that was God's priest or God's appointed judge, you couldn't question it. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 8. If there arise a matter too hard for thee in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and stroke, and here was a matter that the local court found difficult to handle, possibly because it was something that happened in the village and everybody was related to it. So it says in verse 9, this shall be escalated. It had to go up to a higher court in Jerusalem. They shall come to the place of God's name, to the judge in those days, and inquire, and they shall show the sentence of judgment. Look at verse 10. And thou shalt do according to the sentence which they of that place which Yahweh shall choose shall show thee, and shall observe to do according to all that they inform thee, according to the sentence of the law that they shall teach thee, according to the judgment that they shall tell thee, thou shalt do. Thou shalt not decline from the sentence which they shall show thee, to the right hand or to the left. And if anybody won't hearken, it goes on to say in verse 12, then that is a death sentence. If people say, well, I'm not going to accept the judgment, it was a death sentence. The result in verse 13, people hear and they fear and do no more presumptuously. And you see, that's why God's law had to be respected. So there was no plea bargaining. You couldn't say, look, I'll plead guilty to one offence and you drop the other 50 charges like they happen in the court today. There was no parole where you were let out of jail early because the jails were too full. There was no mitigating circumstances you could bring up to reduce sentences. I just picked up this article in the paper just before we left home. A case that went through our courts in Adelaide. This guy is a cocaine dealer and cocaine user, committed enormous number of frauds, particularly on the taxation office, and stole from the taxation office over $100,000 by falsely claiming GST refunds. He pleaded guilty to some charges in which the prosecutors agreed to drop the other 22 fraud offences. And this is what his QC said to the judge. He comes from a loving background but has always been competing with his stepsisters and stepbrothers. He was in a very rich family and tried to take shortcuts to prove himself successful. He wanted to overachieve, but by taking shortcuts he failed. I mean, he committed about 40 offences, deliberate offences against the taxation department. And they're pleading because he was competing with his older brothers and sisters. I would ask Your Honour to fashion a sentence that is not crushing upon this poor man. When God said, you know, that which is absolutely just and right shall be applied. And laws were designed to stop repeat offending. Now, there were also death penalties in the law that we need to think about. There were serious crimes to which God attracted the death penalty: homosexuality, adultery, letting your proven dangerous ox kill people. Now that one could be commuted, and I'll talk about that one later on, but you could get off that one in certain circumstances. But one thing that always got a death penalty was defiance. It had fatal consequences. You might remember the man who gathered sticks on the Sabbath and was stoned for it. And you might think, well, what a horrible thing to get stoned for, just picking up a few sticks. Well, the difference was the law of the Sabbath had just been given. He knew what the law was. His attitude said, I don't care what God says, I'm still going to do it. And that was something that got a death penalty. Blasphemers, there was a case of a man who blasphemed God, and that was also a death penalty. Sinners who refused to repent and change their ways eventually faced the death penalty. Idolatry and most types of immorality were also punishable by death under God's law. What was noticeable about this was it was the deliberateness or the degree of defiance that was involved that mattered. I want you to quote some words from Brother Islip Collier in Conviction and Conduct, where he talks about this matter of sin. There are some transgressions for which God has in a special sense expressed his abhorrence, and which may therefore be regarded as exceptionally offensive. And the list I've just given you are those that God finds exceptionally offensive. Murder, homosexuality, all of those horrible sins of the flesh, God says, I find them offensive. But apart from this, the depths of a man's guilt is determined not by reference to the degree of harm he does to other men. I mean, who did the man picking up sticks on the Sabbath really upset or hurt? Who did he hurt? He didn't hurt anybody picking up sticks, did he really? But you see, it was a very dangerous thing to do when God had just given that law and everybody understood that law. And defiance was therefore put on the same level as some of those more horrible sins. Brother Collier says it's the degree of deliberateness with which the law is violated In other words, sins of presumption are always worse than sins of infirmity. And we all have sins of infirmity where just through weakness and tiredness and our own personalities, we sometimes fail to do what we should do. Or we fall into a sin of weakness. That's something which we all have in our problem. But a sin of presumption which says, I don't care what God says, that's a very dangerous place to be. So what might look like a minor breach became a major issue of defiance. And they always had fatal consequences. Look at one in Leviticus 24 and verse 10. I'll just show you one of these, and there are several of them scattered through the law, as case law for future reference. The man with the sticks on the Sabbath was one. Here's the other one. Leviticus 24 and verse 10. The son of an Israelitish woman, whose father was an Egyptian. He might have been one of the mixed multitude that came out. He may have been a young person at the time they left Egypt. But he went out among the children of Israel, and this son of the Israelitish woman and a man of Israel strove together in the camp, and the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of Yahweh and cursed. And they brought him unto Moses. You know what happened in the end? They inquired of God, and they laid their hands upon him. And it says in verse 15, and thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, whoever so curses his God shall bear his sin, and he shall be put to death. And so he was. And there's an example of a case of open defiance and cursing of God that was not to be tolerated. So it's the degree of presumption or defiance or deliberateness that involves in a sin, which really gives it some degree above sins of infirmity. Now, look at some of the things for which death penalty is applied. And we won't go through these, but they're pretty obvious. Murder, rape, incest, defiance to parents, bestiality, gross negligence, adultery, homosexuality, wizards, witchcraft, false prophets, idolatry, blasphemy, sacrilege, usurping the priesthood, which was Korah's problem, and cursing one's parents. So all of those were capital offences. They were things which specifically said no way out of that. In Leviticus 24 and verse 17, deliberate murder is described. And he that killeth any man shall be surely put to death. He that killeth a beast shall make it good beast for beast. So if you went out and just killed someone's animal without any good reason, then you had to make it good. Notice there was always that reparation factor, which we don't get in our crime scene today. If you killed somebody, there was no way that you could escape the death penalty. But if it was a case of unintended manslaughter, there was, of course, the cities of refuge where you could go and have that matter properly judged. In verse 22, even foreigners who lived in Israel lived under the same law. You'll have one manner of law, as for the stranger as for one of your own country. Why? Because Yahweh is consistent. So people who came into Israel had to abide by the laws of Israel, whether or not they were spiritual Jews or not. They all had to go under the same law. So there was one law for everybody. One thing you could not do was to mutilate somebody else. Verse 19, if a man cause a blemish in his neighbour, as he hath done, so shall it be done to him. So to deliberately harm or maim somebody was something that you were not allowed to do. Another thing that was ruthlessly punished was false accusations. Come to Deuteronomy chapter 19. Now, something God absolutely hated was false witnesses. We saw them come to their fore when the Lord Jesus Christ was on trial, how men were paid to get up and give false witness that did not agree. And there's no record that they were ever punished for that, because they were those that the Pharisees and the priests were using to get Jesus convicted. But it was a classic case of an absolute breach of the law. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 18. Or verse 16, if a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him, wrong. So he's falsely accusing this other person. The matter will be decided before God. In verse 17, both the men shall stand before Yahweh, and the priests and the judges in those days, and they shall make diligent inquisition. And if the witness is found to be a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, look at verse 19. Then you shall do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. So shall you put away the evil from among you. Notice the deterrent factor in verse 20. And those which remain shall hear and fear, and no more commit such an evil thing among you. So if you were lying in court to get somebody else stoned, and you were found to be a liar, then you would be stoned. If you were lying to the convicted of theft, so they had to pay for 5 oxen, then you would have to pay for the 5 oxen. See, there's that absolute justice. Today you can get up in court. You may be convicted of perjury if you actually get up and say something false in court that's proven in court. But people do it all the time. They lie in court and get away with it. Not under God's law. Look what it says in verse 21. Now this comes to a passage which does cause concern for us if we don't understand it properly. And thine eye shall not pity. So this is what happens to the false witness. Life shall go for life, eye for eye, and tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot. Now the Bible skeptic would say, well, there's your God, mutilating people, cutting off hands, cutting off feet, poking out eyes. Is that what God wanted them to do? This eye for eye concept is one of the most criticised about Moses' law. Some Jews used to use it, as Jesus said. Some people want revenge. You have been said by those of old time, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Some people love that. But Jesus said, it shall not be so for you. Resist not evil. Turn the other cheek. If a man smites you on the right cheek, turn the left also. So what was God intending here? Well, in fact, God did not encourage them to demand revenge. What he said here was, if a man has thought by false witness to get somebody else stoned, then he will be stoned as a false witness. God's not saying, the people would go around saying, right, you poked out my eye, here goes yours. That was not the intention of the law. What it was saying was that the deterrent had to be that people would be punished for their careless crimes. Now look at the 3 contexts where this occurs. You see, this was a metaphorical way of saying that the penalty for serious crimes had to be appropriate to the crime. God didn't want Israel walking around mutilated. What he said was, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So the principle is, what you thought to make happen to the other person, there's got to be a penalty which is appropriate in this case law. Now there are 3 times this comes up. The first one is where a person lies in court, you suffer the intended punishment. That one's very clear. In Exodus 21 verse 12 or 22, we have the death of an innocent bystander. So 2 men are having a brawl and they're bashing and thrashing, and they kill an innocent bystander. There had to be an appropriate punishment. In Leviticus 24, we just read it back there, deliberate physical mutilation caused to the person of others. So there had to be some punishment devised that would actually, and I don't really think that God said go around and poke out the other guy's eye. What it was saying was there will be serious consequences. And so this metaphorical eye for eye, serious consequences if you commit these crimes. The point was you would think very carefully about committing them. You would make sure you didn't get into situations where you might even be tempted to cause these sort of harms. And you would never go about to mutilate somebody else. And they're the 3 contexts of the eye for eye principle. And the punishment, and the idea of the eye for eye was a metaphorical thing. And Jesus put the whole bar a whole lot higher when he said to us, you forgive, you resist not evil, you turn the other cheek. And true Israelites would have tried to do that, but the law had to make sure that these crimes were punished accordingly. It had to be proportionate to the crime. It wasn't about God demanding mutilation as a punishment. Okay, well I want to come on now to another principle. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 17, we have another law. This is a case where a man marries a woman and then makes an accusation that she was not a virgin. And without going through all the details of what happens here, there's a very public redemption that takes place for this woman. So the husband has married her and decided perhaps he thought he should have married somebody else, and he tries to get out of her. He tries to get out of this marriage. And he makes an accusation of unchastity. A bit of the same principle here as you find in the law of jealousy in Numbers 5. But the point of this case law, and this was case law, the point of this was that the woman, if she was innocent, had to be publicly vindicated. Look at Deuteronomy 25 and verse 1. I want to get to a principle now that's really important for us in ecclesial life. If there be a controversy between men and they come to judgment, the judges may judge them, and they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. So in a case where there was a clear right and wrong, everybody had to know that that was the judgment of the priest or the Levite or the judge. Now that's a really important principle, brethren and sisters. Sometimes people are falsely accused or maliciously accused. And given the victim mentality which prevails in our world, and I'm not saying there aren't victims, don't get me wrong on that, there are. But given the victim mentality in our world, this is something that will happen more often, and it's happened a lot. That people can be falsely or maliciously accused. In the true spirit of Christ, even a person who's been falsely accused has little room to defend themselves against that accusation. The Lord was falsely accused, blatantly falsely accused, answered not a word. But others need to step up. Others need to ensure that someone's good name is not smeared by innuendo or malicious accusations. If that's not done, as the world says, mud sticks. People think, well, where there's smoke, there has to be fire. They mightn't have any idea what's really going on, but they think there's got to be something in it. And that's why there has to be the justification of the righteous and the condemnation of the wicked. Now look at these two proverbs, both from the ESV, which make it a little clearer. It is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the righteous of justice. Same principle, isn't it? You shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination to Yahweh. And if our brethren and sisters are falsely accused, then we need to stand up for them and their reputations and their value to the work that they can do amongst us, and make sure that they are given their proper justice. And I say that from some very bitter experience that we've had over in our state recently, where people have been falsely accused. So we're going to see the law here has some very wise principles in it. Superior principles of God's code of justice compared to the society we live in. There was no getting off on technicalities, because in many of these cases God intervened himself in the judgment. Our judges have the problem that they get two different stories, they get only half the real evidence presented to them. I remember being involved in a case where I had to give evidence, and I kept saying to the prosecutor, but that's not the whole story. You need to know this, this and this and this. And there are so many other things that are not coming out. And he said to me, Mr. Cowie, it's not about justice, it's about theatre. We're only going to put in front of the jury what we have agreed with the opposition QC will be allowed to be put in front of the jury. Nothing else is allowed to come out. So only half the story gets out. And technicalities come into it. It wasn't handled right. There wasn't the right order of things in the arrest part of the crime. Well, And to God's laws, because God was involved in most cases, things got decided properly. And it'll be the same in the kingdom, brethren and sisters. There were no prison sentences in those days. Punishments were immediate, weighed up according to the crime, and fines were imposed that had to be paid or worked off. You went into service and paid off your crime. If the offender can't pay, they had to work it off. Death penalties applied for those serious things. Now, I want you to come back to Exodus 22 about this man that steals an ox, because it goes on to talk about theft in the middle of the night. And we had a most interesting case of this recently in Adelaide. Verse 22 of Exodus 22, it says, "If a thief be found breaking up," that is breaking in, we'd say, "and be smitten that he die, there shall be no blood shed for him." In other words, if a person breaks into your home in the middle of the night and he ends up getting killed in that process, tough luck. If it happened in the daylight when you could see him and identify him, and then you killed him, well then you would have a problem on your hands. Now, we had a case recently in Adelaide where there was an 85-year-old pensioner living on his own. He suffered repeated break-ins from the same drug-crazed repeat offender that kept breaking into his house to steal his goods. In the end, he got sick of it and he armed himself. And the next time the guy came through the window, he got both barrels of a shotgun. Guess who was charged? The 85-year-old was charged with murder. Well, he wouldn't have been under the law of Moses. And it just shows you the difference, doesn't it, between the way that our law applies and this law applied, because there were no repeat offenders. And this sort of thing just shows you the difference of the way it's applied. In Exodus 23 and verse 4, if the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, so if he's stolen your ox and you caught him down the road, whether it be ox or ass, he shall restore double. So it wasn't saying, "Oh, look, sorry, I stole your ox, so here it is back, I won't do it again." No, he had to pay double. So the time you'd lost and the worry you'd had was compensated for. And there are so many case laws like this that just show you how different God was. Now, what happens if somebody steals your car from the car park tonight, takes it down the road, thrashes it to death and then tortures it? Who's going to pay for it? Now, if you're insured, the best you're going to come off with is the loss of your excess and an increase in your insurance policy. So you're a loser. If it's not insured, is the criminal going to pay for it? Even if they catch them. Are they going to pay for it? Of course not. You're going to have to pay for it. It's not the way the law of Moses works. You see, this is case law. Under the law of Moses, there was always reparation if you offended, stole, broke something else that belonged to somebody else. We have the Gang of 49, they call them in Adelaide. People, and these guys are most between 12 and 17. Some of them have stolen and torched over 100 cars. And they keep letting them out and they keep doing it because the worst you get is a couple of months in the clink, educate yourself in crime and come out and do it again. That's the difference, wasn't it? Now, back in Deuteronomy 25, let's have a look at something about the justice law that was also very merciful. In Deuteronomy 25, it talks about the punishment of stripes. It says there in verse 2, "It shall be if the wicked man is worthy to be beaten." So the judges would decide the number of stripes, but there was a limit on the number of stripes. Now look how they did it. They would take the man into a public place, he would lie down on the ground, and be beaten before the face of the judge. So the judge would have to stand there and watch this man get this beating, and they used to beat them with those whips and cords, according to his fault, by a certain number. So there is the room for the judge to decide the number of stripes that was worthy. We know that Paul received 39 stripes several times. 40 stripes he may give him. So the maximum number of stripes was 40 and not exceed. Now, why not? This is where Deuteronomy is so beautiful, because it brings in the emotions into the matter and it brings in the feelings into the matter. If he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. So you see, even the judge that was administering this punishment had to remember that we are all capable of making mistakes. We all sometimes get into problems because of our stupidity. And so God says, even in administering justice, you have to be aware that we are all sinners. And remember your own failings. And Paul says that about the law of Christ as well, doesn't he? You which are spiritual, deliver those that have fallen into sin, but consider yourselves also that you can be tempted. And even the judges administering the punishment had to be aware of there were limitations, and it was merciful justice. This was to try and correct people from their evil ways. The law said elsewhere that if people came back as repeat offenders, then they would be treated as the defiant, and there would be nothing more for them but death. Now, remarkably, OH&S laws existed in the law of Moses 3,500 years ago. Negligence was a criminal offence. Houses had to have battlements around them, so a wall on top of the house to make sure people didn't accidentally walk backwards and go over to the street. So there was this provision for safety in the building of houses. Dangerous animals had to be secured. If you had an ox that was known to push or to gore people and you didn't correctly pen it up, there was a death penalty or a very large fine. And we'll talk about that one, God willing, on Saturday. You could not leave a dangerous situation on a work site. And God said, as an example, you dig a hole and you don't cover it up and somebody falls in it, you will pay. So that was again a case of case law. There were other things you could do on building sites, obviously, that were equally dangerous. But that was an example. And God recognised that there would be accidents. And so the cities of refuge were determined by God. But you might be spared from the avenger of blood. You might not have your life taken away. If you got to the city of refuge in time, if your case was heard and it was decided it was a genuine accident, you could not go home until the high priest died. Think about it if you're running a business and you kill somebody. Or on your farm there wasn't adequate safety and somebody got killed because a dangerous animal got out. You see, there was this city of refuge, but what an inconvenience to stay there, away from your business, away from your farm, away from your family, until the death of the high priest. There was a motivation there to make sure that you prevented accidents. Now, I worked in workers' compensation. I saw incredible accidents happen because employers just did not care. They took the safety guards off machines to make them work faster. Remember one young chap we had, he was working on a machine that was actually punching out aluminium window frames. And it used to get stuck, so they said, look, just take the safety guards off, here's a hammer, when it gets stuck, just build it there. Climb into the machine, build it there and it'll work. Well, it did, it actually moulded his knee into the shape of a window frame. Before the ambulance got there, the safety guards were back on. And they got away with it. So you see, under this, you didn't want to hurt somebody. You had a great consciousness of safety because there were great great consequences if you were responsible. So, brethren and sisters, that's just a little summary of the things we can see from God's law. We need to remember that we are serving the same God that instituted that kind of law, those principles, those absolute morals and values to his people Israel. That was the ultimate theocracy. And God does not change or move with the times. God has the same view of wickedness and sin and evil as he always did. And the time is coming when the wicked shall be taken away from the earth. I say that because I get the feeling these days that a lot of Christadelphians think, as we saw from Brother Rob Heineman's comment the other night, that somehow God's too tough, God's too hard, he's too inflexible. Well, God says this about the kingdom: the righteous shall rejoice when he seeth the vengeance, shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked. We don't enjoy the death of the wicked any more than God does. But something has to be done about the state and the moral condition of our world. So a man shall say, there is a reward for the righteous. Verily is a God that judgeth in the earth. The wicked shall be cut off from the earth, and the transgressor shall be rooted out of it. That's talking about the kingdom. And the place of the wicked will not be, says Psalm 37. Now that's the way we understand our God. And in his kingdom, many of these laws will come back into being amongst the mortal population of the world. And it says in Isaiah 26, with my soul have I desired thee in the night seasons. With my spirit within me I will seek thee early. For when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. And everything we read about the kingdom and the way the mortals will live, we'll see many of these laws and principles reinstated in the earth. They will live under a very just and moral and civil code. And we will be their judges. We will be those that make decisions about the things that they do. So let us not be deceived by the current world systems, legal systems, and the way they have so far departed from the morals of God. Let us not imagine we can change God, or assume that God is not involved anymore as some do. He is the great potter, we are the clay. He determines right from wrong. It is not decided by the corrupted thinking of mankind. So when we read the law of Moses and we read about these laws and these case laws and the way they were to be applied, let us realise this is a wise and understanding law that God gave to his people, elevating them above all the nations that were around about them, and bringing in justice and truth and righteousness as a possibility if they would but keep his law.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.